Worldwood presents Wolves of the Empire, written by J.C. Duncan and read by Sean Barrett. Preface. At the conclusion of Emperor's Acts in the spring of 1041 AD, Harald Sigurdsson was a denuded force in the Eastern Roman Empire, returning from a long, tenacious, but ultimately failed campaign in Sicily and Italy, only to find the palace consumed in his absence by conflict and corruption. In defeating an attempted armed coup in the palace, conducted by hired mercenaries led by his old rival, the Greek mercenary Bardas, Harald managed to secure his position, at least temporarily, and twisted the situation to his advantage to secure the trust of the ailing emperor Michael IV at the cost of the emperor's brother and true power behind the throne, the eunuch John the Parakoimomenos. Although managing to retain his position as the commander of the Varangian Guard, he was sent overseas to remove him from court, then tarnished by defeats in Sicily and Italy that, while arguably not his fault, would have degraded his standing with the people and the political players nonetheless. Not that many of the empire's elites would have been upset to see Harald's star fade. The defeats in the far western reaches of the empire were not important to those fighting for power in the capital, more focused on their own successes than the health of the empire they were supposed to govern. The bringing down of a powerful outsider, a man who held rather too much sway over the Emperor Michael and the Empress Zoe for the liking of many in the ruling class, would have been cause for outright celebration to many. For Harald, this diminishment of his reputation and position would have been completely unacceptable. He had saved the emperor's life and his own titles, and defeated two of his key enemies in the palace, but none of that was what truly mattered to him. Harald Hardrada was in Constantinople for one clear purpose: to gild the path back to the Norwegian throne. He needed to build a reputation as a formidable leader and obtain wealth with which to buy the men and influence to retake his half-brother Olaf's lost crown. Harald dearly wanted to return home, but his last campaign being a failure, his last battle being a defeat, cannot be the way he left the empire. Peace may have come at last to the palace, but the storm of war is what Harald seeks. He needs the riches and renown of battle to realize his ambitions, and his ambitions will not be contained. Enemies of the empire should beware. Harald will be seeking a chance to wash away the stains of his recent past, and he will be happiest to raise the imperial banners of war and do it in a biblical torrent of someone else's blood. Part 1. Oathsworn. Chapter 1. King Haakon, Norway, Spring 1098 A.D. "The king is here! The king is here!" Ingvar looked up in surprise as a boy younger than himself ran past their temporary camp on the outskirts of King Haakon in the middle of the afternoon, shouting his message for all to hear, repeating it again and again as he went down the long field of tents. The boy was gleeful as he ran and shouted, almost hopping in excitement. And exciting it was indeed, for every man there had gathered in that place to hear the words of King Magnus, to know if he planned to go on campaign, and to receive his judgment on 100 different matters of law and dispute. "I thought he was not due until tomorrow," Ingvar's father Jarl Haakon said to the other men sitting around with them in the glorious afternoon sun. "I heard that too," one of the others said with a shrug. "It is unusual for the king to arrive so early. The thing is not for 2 more days. The weather is good, the roads are hard, and the sea is calm. Perhaps his journey was simply better than expected, like ours was." Haakon grunted his assent at that. The logic could not be denied. "Well, let's be up and go and greet him. We do not want to be noted as lacking in presence or enthusiasm." His small herd sprang into action, leaving the rest of their meal where it sat and strapping on their sword belts. The Jarl hurried to put on his finest tunic, one he had reserved for this very moment, and for the days of the thing, the great regional meeting itself. It was a rich work, a deep red with gold thread woven into the serpentine patterns at the neck and cuffs. Ingvar thought it was fitting, making him look every inch the wealthy lord, and he smiled at his father in pride. "Come on, boy," Hakon said with a wink and a thump on the shoulder. "It's time to go and meet your king. If you're lucky, at some point during the thing, you might be introduced to him. That would be quite something." "I will swear my loyalty to him," said Ingvar eagerly, but Hakon frowned and stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "No, you will not. You are not a lord to give such an oath to the king. I have sworn my loyalty to him, and you to me. That is our way. You would embarrass me if you did something so foolish. Tell me you will contain yourself and respect our customs." Ingvar bit his tongue, face going red in shame. He lowered his eyes and nodded. "I am sorry, father. I know the laws." Hakon laughed. "Good lad. I know you are just overexcited, but a man of strength is calm and controlled at all times, especially in front of his king." "I understand, father." "Good. Then let's go. I want a good spot by the road." Hakon led his men out of the now bustling camp towards the road into town. The boy running through the camp was no accident. The king would have sent messengers ahead to make sure his people had time to welcome him properly. Nothing would be more embarrassing than to arrive unseen and unheralded, and not receive the adulation and respect of his people. Such a thing might cause him to turn about and leave, or punish whoever had failed to organize a reception. Hakon secured them a good position along the side of the main square, just outside the doors of the hall, as other jarls jostled into position around the entire space and lined the road beyond. Hakon stood proudly in front of his herd, arranged in organized ranks to show themselves as the warriors they were. Hakon gave a friendly nod to his friend Jarl Torvald, who was standing with his own contingent just a few paces away. "Don't you look fine, Jarl Hakon?" Torvald called out with a grin. "That red dress is almost as pretty as any my 3 daughters own." Hakon laughed a little too loudly at the quip, and Ingvar could feel his prickle of annoyance. "You have 3 daughters, Jarl Torvald? I thought you had 2 goats and a son," Hakon called back, to a ripple of laughter around the square. Such words might have led to blows between enemies, but Hakon and Torvald walked towards each other, both beaming broadly, and embraced to make sure everyone knew there was no steel in their words. "Your father is a sharp man. Is he as good with a sword as with his tongue?" rasped a voice from behind Ingvar, where he stood at the side of his father's men, and Ingvar looked back in surprise to see Erik Sveitunger standing behind him, peering over his shoulder into the square. The old Varangian gave Ingvar a cheeky smile. "Erik, Despite the old man's friendliness to him, Ingvar still felt very awkward and did not know how to reply. Erik was a famous man, a companion of kings, and as such many men might call him lord, or show him great deference. But here he was lurking in the background and joking with Ingvar as if he was a friend. "Ah, your tongue is not so quick as your father's, then?" Erik said with a soft chuckle, and Ingvar flushed again in embarrassment. "Don't worry, I have that effect from time to time." "I'm sorry, why are you here?" Ingvar whispered. "For the same reason as you, to see the king." "Yes, but I mean, here with us. Surely you should be with Jarl Halfdan on the steps of the hall." Erik looked towards the great hall's doors almost curiously, just a couple of dozen paces away, as if he had not thought about it. Jarl Halfdan was just appearing with his large entourage, spreading out to occupy all the space along the hall's front. "I suppose so. I have not been invited to stand with him, but he would not refuse me." He winked. "But perhaps I would be more comfortable here, unseen." "Erik!" Jarl Hakon called out uncomfortably loudly, causing Erik to wince slightly, before smiling politely and bowing his head fractionally to the Jarl, who was walking back to his men and had caught sight of his son and the old warrior. "Jarl Hakon," Eric replied. "What gives us the honour of your company here? Is my son bothering you?" "Your son does not bother me, as you know, Jarl Hakon." "Good, good." Hakon came over and gave Eric an enthusiastic arm clasp and stood back, looking around. Come and stand to the fore of my men, in a place of respect." Eric gave Ingvar a sideways glance and a subtle roll of his eyes, but quickly banished both and nodded. "That is very generous of you." Hakon shuffled a few men out of the way to make a path and gestured at Ingvar to follow. They made their way into the front rank and stood there while Hakon fussed over the rest of his men, finally satisfied and taking his place once more at their head. Eric leaned in close to Ingvar. "Enjoy the proceedings, my boy. The king likes to put on a show." Ingvar's attention was dragged away by a commotion from the street leading out of town, and everyone around the space craned their heads to look for the source of the sound of marching men. Even to Ingvar's ears, that sound was unmistakable. Armored men marching together make a certain sound unlike any other, wood and metal rattling and scraping and slapping together in a unique cacophony. Sure enough, the first ranks of armored warriors soon appeared, marching in a column 4 men across, with their shields on their backs and spears in their hands. For any other lord arriving so armed, they would have been preceded by a man carrying a green branch to show they meant no hostility, but no such man led them. The king did not have to show he had no hostile intent in his own kingdom. Violence was his right. Marching with his men armed for war wherever they wanted was his right alone. It was intimidating, as it was meant to be. The column, now visibly at least 100 strong, were outnumbered hugely by the waiting crowd. But in formation, in mail and shining helmets, and with spear points waving above their heads like a forest of deadly saplings, they dominated the square. Then King Magnus came into view, riding languidly on a huge dark stallion, a dozen other mounted men, his closest advisers and family, following behind. He was a young man still, the king, perhaps only 25 years old, but already a respected leader and warrior. The first years of his reign had been troubled. The northern jarls had rejected him, rallying around another king and descendant of Hardrada called Hakon Magnusson, who not only shared Ingvar's father's name, but had been his uncle by marriage. This was the root of Ingvar's father's intense desire to show his loyalty. For just 4 years ago, he had come here to King Haakon, along with most of the lords of the north, to pledge their loyalty to King Hakon Magnusson and to oppose the young King Magnus. Magnus had avoided war and shrewdly built his position politically, isolating his rival king, provoking him and embarrassing him, until the pretender had conveniently died in a hunting accident. Everyone knew Magnus had arranged it. Magnus wanted everyone to know it. With a single death, he had secured the entire kingdom for himself, and his first move had been to graciously pardon everyone who quickly moved to support him, and then ruthlessly destroy those few foolish enough to hesitate. Ingvar had been too young to witness the events, still at home with his mother, but his father had kissed the new king's sword and became a forgiven man and a vocal supporter. Ingvar felt no shame over it. Everyone said Magnus was a king worthy of loyalty, and they quietly forgot the time when they had nearly been deadly enemies. "Hail, King Magnus!" someone shouted, and there was a roar of noise as everyone else along the road joined in. The king, serene and unmoved, simply looked around with his back straight and chin high, soaking in the display of loyalty and respect. The armored men split in two as they entered the square ahead of the king, and they moved to line both sides, a single rank deep, facing inwards towards the king, symbolically surrounding him in a ring of steel. The disloyalty of the north may have been over, but the king made sure to subtly remind them that it was not completely forgotten. King Magnus rode into that protected space and smartly dismounted, casually handing the reins over to one of his men, looking around and finally acknowledging the crowd with a soft and confident smile. At the entrance to the hall, Jarl Halfdan stepped forwards to greet him. "Welcome to Thinghagen, King Magnus. The town and people are ready to heed your call for the Thing, and to receive your wisdom and your judgment. My hall is open for you and your people. For as long as you are here, it is your home." Magnus walked forward almost languidly, soaking up the moment, and then he offered his arm to the Lord of Thinghagen to clasp with a grin. "I thank you for your welcome, Jarl Halfdan, and for the warmth of your hearth. I look forward to addressing the Thing and hearing the counsel of my most respected subjects." Halfdan glowed at the praise and inclined his head, gesturing the king to take pride of place on the steps of the hall, where he would be able to address the crowd. Magnus walked up the half-dozen steps and turned, one hand on his sword, and waited for the crowd to fall still and silent. "It is my honor and pleasure to come here, to hear the words of the bravest men of Norway, and to let them hear mine." There was a roar of appreciation from the gathered men, and the king quickly held up his hand for quiet again. "I am moved to see the display of duty and service you have put forth today, and I in return will perform my duty and service to you. I will hear your pleadings for justice and judgment, and render it fairly for all men to see. I know that you all seek strength and wealth for our people, and I will present my plans to achieve that, to once more lead the unified men of Norway to the heights of glory and all that it brings." The whoops and cheers of appreciation were ever louder around the square, and the king let the clamour of the crowd go on for a while, before holding his hand up again. They all fell silent, leaning in, listening, hoping and expecting the king would announce his plan for a great campaign. Ingvar could feel the excitement and tension like a living thing. The king held that moment, then smiled, sweeping his arm wide. "I am forgetting myself, for the Thing has not yet begun. The time for speeches is later. The time for drinking and celebration is now." Then he signalled to his men, who broke their formation up and drifted in to gather as a group, allowing the rest of the crowd to fill the square. The king turned to speak to Jarl Halfdan, signalling that he was done. The gathering broke into excited conversation and laughter as the king spoke with the lord of the town. "He is a very clever young man," Eric said in amusement. Ingvar turned to him. "In what way?" "What he just did, testing the waters, whetting our interest in the campaign, and then avoiding announcing it. It will be all anyone can talk about now, and he will be able to judge exactly how to propose it. A good politician, our young king. It is even more important than being a great warrior." Ingvar nodded seriously, thinking about it. He had almost no experience with politics, even less than he had with war, but Eric's words made sense to him. His father came over and gently took Eric's arm. "I shall take you to stand at Jarl Halfdan's side. The king should see you." Hakon nodded forcefully. "I suppose so. Lead on, Jarl Hakon," said Eric, with subtle reluctance that Ingvar saw but his father missed. Then he was gone, whisked away by the excited Hakon, who was doubtless thrilled with the perceived chance to be seen as close to Eric, and witnessed by all to be escorting him to the great hall. Ingvar followed behind, careful to keep his distance, remembering his father's warning. Jarl Halfdan saw the two men come over and gave Eric a polite smile and greeting. Ingvar could not hear the words that were spoken, but Halfdan gestured to his right, and his men made space for Eric to stand near him as the king spoke to other nobles. Eric wore a faint look of amusement as he stood there in line among the jarls and warriors, waiting his turn. Hakon gestured furtively for Ingvar to come and stand behind him, and he did, standing there and watching as the king greeted each man in turn, before coming to Eric. Magnus looked at Eric curiously. Then Halfdan leaned in to whisper in his ear, and the young king nodded sagely. Eric's Feitungur, I am pleased to finally meet you. My father spoke of you many times. He did? Eric looked surprised. Of course. He had great respect for you, and the service you did for my grandfather. Eric bowed. I am honored. You have been a great servant of my family, yet we have never met. Where have you been all these years? Eric smiled sadly. I was not in favor after your grandfather's tragic death. I went to raise my children and farm my land, and leave the troubles of rule to the younger men. Not in favor? Nonsense, you would always have had a place in my father's court and mine. Eric bowed his head again. I am deeply honored to hear that, Lord Magnus, but I rather enjoyed my quiet life these last years. Understandable. So what brings you here? I hear you have been telling the story of my grandfather's life. Eric nodded a little nervously. I came to show my support and offer advice if it was asked for. But a young warrior asked me a question about King Harald, and I answered. I accept some might claim that my answer has been a little long-winded, Eric said with a self-effacing laugh. I first meant to tell the story to him alone, but a few men gathered, and then a few more. Eric spread his hands helplessly. And now he has the whole hall listening every afternoon into the night, Halfdan said with a wry smile. Eric shrugged helplessly. Many men wanted to hear the story, it turns out, but the rest can be told another time. I will not disturb your counsel. Magnus shook his head. Nonsense! The thing has not yet begun, and I would love to hear the story of my grandfather, told by one who was there. I have never heard it from anyone who shared his time in the East. Come, sit with me in the hall, and speak to me of my family's past. It would please me. Then the king looked around at the crowd. And anyone else who wishes to hear it? Eric flushed. You honor me, my king, but I do not wish to intrude. Nonsense! There will be several hundred angry men if I do not allow it, said Magnus, and Ingvar detected the first hint of an edge in the king's words. Eric surrendered. As you wish, my lord. Continue with this tale to the one who asked, and with your permission I will join you. Magnus gave a good-natured smile and started into the hall. Come then, I need a seat and some ale. My journey was long and boring, and I wish to hear the tales of the glory of my ancestor. They followed Magnus up to the head of the hall, and Hakon and Ingvar held back a bit, angling towards one end of the long table, not presuming to sit close to the king. That space was reserved for the great lords of the north, the king's closest and most powerful allies. But Magnus offered a seat just a few paces down from himself to Eric, and then snapped his fingers at Hakon, pointing at the benches much nearer to himself than they had chosen. Here, Jarl Hakon, sit with us to enjoy this tale. This is an enormous honor, Ingvar's father whispered in his ear. Do not shame us. No, father. Hakon went to the proffered bench, sitting between one of the Jarls of Lade and the king's cousin, nodding to both proudly. Ingvar slotted in next to Eric when the old man waved him over. Come then, Eric, said the king as a silver-chased mug of ale was offered to him, and the rest of the hall started to fill in. Where were you with the story? Eric coughed and thought about it, then nodded. The great hall started to fall silent as his old eyes drifted away, his mind moving back to his time all those long decades ago, when he had been a young man in the service of the Empire. Chapter 2. Constantinople, Spring 1041 AD. "Harald!" I shouted, banging on the door to his quarters. I was in my full ceremonial kit, brightly coloured cloak over my mail, helmet and spear polished to a bright sheen. Harald should have been, too. He should have been outside at the head of his men, ready to march to the palace gate and escort the imperial family to the Hagia Sophia for the service of blessing. But he was not there. I was furious. It was unlike Harald to be late for anything, to slacken in his duties. He never got drunk. He never lounged late in bed. I had twin fears, either that he had snuck out to be in Empress Zoe's bed, or that he had been poisoned. The implications of him being caught in Zoe's bed, on that day of all days, were so dire that I was actively hoping he had been poisoned. "Harald!" I said again, banging mercilessly on the door. I kicked at it furiously, even as it opened and Harald appeared, in his full regalia. I lowered my foot with a scowl. "I had assumed you were dead." Harald looked at me nonchalantly. "And did that bring you joy?" "More joy than trying to explain to the men why their commander is late for such an important event?" I heard a shuffle behind him, and my brows creased. "Do you have a woman in there? You are neglecting your duties for a woman?" I felt a sudden, insane fear that it was the Empress. Would either of them be so stupid as to have her snuck into the Varangian barracks? No, surely not. My fear overcoming my sense, I barged in and saw the source of the noise and froze, feeling foolish. It was Thorir, who was folding some notes and slipping them into his robe. They had clearly been having a quiet meeting about something. "Are you satisfied?" Harald asked coldly. I stepped back with a grunt. "Good, then let's go. I don't wish you to make me late," Harald added acidly. I glared at Thorir as if it was his fault, and Harald's, quiet and tame-banded, just gave me a small shrug that was devoid of any sympathy. Harald set off without saying anything else, and I followed him down the shaded veranda outside his quarters in annoyed silence. "Aren't you going to ask me what I am doing with Thorir?" Harald asked. I sighed. "No. If you wished to tell me, you would. I hope only that it doesn't cause me some intense trouble later, although I am sure that it will." Harald shrugged, his broad shoulders expressive even under his armour, tunic, and cloak of office. The curiosity needled at me as we walked down the stairs and into the main barracks yard. "Well, what are you planning with him, then?" I finally said. "Oh, I am not going to tell you yet." "Then why ask me if I was going to ask you?" I said, exasperated. Harald looked back with a smile. "You are so easily riled up these days, Eric. You need to calm yourself and trust me to conduct my business and know what you need to know and when. How can you get back to your old self? You know, I think you need a woman." I cursed under my breath, not least because it was true on most counts, perhaps all counts. But I had reason to be so on edge and nervous. It was only a month since the attack on the palace and our narrow defeat of it, a month since we had buried nearly 200 of our own men who died at their posts defending the palace, betrayed by the very woman they were charged to defend. Zoe had confessed to Harald that she had organized mercenaries and traitors to attack the palace and kill her husband, and tried to ensure we had not been there to defend him. And we wouldn't have been there if Harald had been less bull-headed about everything. I had not forgiven her, even if Harald had forced me to accept it. Forced me to accept that we could not punish her, could not tell her secret. I was bitter every day, and nothing would assuage it. I was only made more bitter that Harald seemingly had forgiven her. Not only forgiven her, but become her lover. He claimed it was only to keep her close, to ensure she didn't dispose of us and keep an eye on our actions. But I knew better than that. I knew the Empress had a hold on him beyond politics and power. I had seen it before in Harald. He was ensorcelled by powerful, ambitious, beautiful women. And Zoe was the paragon of all three. I feared for him. I was angry with him. I was extremely unpleasant to be around, and I knew it. Now, of course, I see that my concerns were perhaps small and petty, while his were vast in scale and pragmatic. But to a man who still clung to the notion that he was good, that he was not just a mercenary killing for gold, but a noble man with a God-given mission of duty and sacrifice, Harald's choices and orders were a terrible burden. But you have seen before, and you will see again. That is why he was a great king, and I was merely a follower. Regardless of my bitter mood, I would not let it affect my duties. In that I was resolute. So I put my sour face away, and I marched out into the great central path of the palace, with my head held high as I beheld the massed ranks of Harald's Varangians. Ah, the memory of that sight still warms my cold, old blood today. We had long been a fearsome fighting force, but the campaign in Sicily, the battles in Italy, and the defeat of the coup had honed us like a well-cared-for sword. Veterans, almost all of us. Many of us had fallen, but those who remained were paramount soldiers, battle-hardened and tested, and loyal to a fever pitch that defies the retelling. They did not know that Zoe had betrayed us. They only knew that we had stood and fought when traitors turned and cowards fled. They knew that when the palace halls had filled with blood, it had been their blades that did the spilling, and their veins that flowed our precious red life force, so that our oaths of duty would remain unbroken. God, my pride in them is impossible to fully name. It is in the beating heart of me, and it will be until the day I finally join them in the soil, that magnificent company of my brothers. They were standing there in the blazing sun, in all their glory, and Harald and I walked to their head, and he smiled at them, for he used their lives like coin. But he loved them too. I know that he did. "What are you waiting for? We have a ceremony to attend." The men laughed, then put their helmets back on and hoisted their shields onto arms and axes onto shoulders, ready to move out as the other detachments of the Imperial Guard stomped down the path to join us, shining in their perfect unity and matching step. We did not march in perfect formation like the other palace guards. No, that was the Roman way, to process in locked step like one man copied 1,000 times. We marched like real warriors, like the killers we were, and we were known for it. The Greeks, of course, looked down on us, said we were too rough and barbarous to be fully trained, but we laughed at their ignorance. We walked our own steps because we had the strength and pride to do so. We were not toy soldiers. We were Varangians. We were joined by the royal family in the hippodrome to mount their magnificent shaded chariots, pulled by white stallions, who were deafened and blinkered so as to remain calm and docile. The emperor was weaker and more sickly than ever. He did not stand. Instead, he was propped up on a cleverly disguised stool, such that it seemed he was merely wearing a billowing set of robes, while 2 attendants stood behind him to support him should he need it. Empress Zoe, on the other hand, looked magnificent, as she always did, and stepped serenely into her chariot with effortless grace up the gilded steps laid out for her, taking her place on the raised, shaded platform behind the driver, and smiling around at the guard. They loved her, and it grated at me. She took every opportunity to thank and praise them for their actions in saving her and her husband. She lavished them with honors and gifts, and the generosity of her personal appearances, and they adored her for it. Bah! Let me move on from such a bitter draught before I become consumed by it. We marched out, behind the perfect block of the Vigla Dagmar, and in front of the riders of the Skolai. And we went through the great gates of the Hippodrome, and the crowd cheered at the sight of us. The Emperor rode first, Zoe behind, but it was noticeable to us, marching all around the imperial family like an armored box, that the cheers were far louder as the Empress passed. She had captured the people with the same charm and radiance as she had captured my man, and the Emperor, while liked, simply could not rival the devotion the people showed her. We were headed towards the Messe, the great road that went from the outer city walls to the magnificent Chalke gate of the palace, through all of the great forums and public spaces. Now, of course, we didn't need to take that longer route to escort the imperial family to the Hagia Sophia. They could have left the palace at the Chalke gate and crossed a mere 100 paces to the cathedral, but the purpose of them going to this service was to be seen going, and to follow the lengthy and complex protocols of these events and festivals. I shall not relate them all to you. It is as boring now as it was then. Suffice it to say, we had an army of officials and palace aides to make sure everything went according to the rules of the ceremonies. The way was laid with flowers and rushes that were ground into the cobbles by our feet, and streamers of colour and petals were thrown over us as we passed, until the canopies above the imperials were littered with them. I mused as we marched that those canopies were there precisely for that reason, not to keep off the sun so much as stop the ruler's magnificent clothes becoming covered in the enthusiastic detritus of flowers and coloured cloth. We passed the great paths that the nobility built for themselves on the peak of the hill, and the nobles gathered there to watch did so with much more restrained and muted enthusiasm than the rest of the people on the road behind us. And there it was, the Hagia Sophia, the greatest building of the world, standing proud with its soaring dome and brooding towers. At Harald's shouted orders, we spread out crisply into a three-sided box around the entrance, protecting the Imperials from all sides while they dismounted their chariots and acknowledged the crowd before heading inside the cathedral with the first bundle. Harald came over to me. You and the 14th bundle can take the inside watch with the first. I will have the 7th and 2nd guard the perimeter. As you command, Protospatarius. 14th, on me, I said, turning to shout at the formation led by Styrbjorn, the goat, who smiled as I looked at him. We are going in? We are going in, I confirmed. He had his men quickly line up and march in by the side entrance, separating and filtering out to take up positions all around the magnificent interior, adding to the constant presence of the first bandon, the Emperor's shields, who never left the imperial family's side. Having another entire bandon guard them while inside the cathedral was superfluous in many ways, but since the attempted assassination, Harald took no chances, and the newly reformed first bandon, who had been almost entirely annihilated while holding their positions in the attack on the inner palace, were still short of men. Afra, who was once more their comes, nodded to me and smiled. Lucky you, eh? Getting to stand in here with the real men? There are real men in here? Where? I asked, looking around dumbly. He laughed and patted me on the shoulder as we stood on the upper balcony, leaning heavily on the marble railing. His old leg injury was troubling him more and more as he aged. He was well past the point most soldiers would have been quietly retired. But Harald was not going to retire, Afra the Constant, the old bandit turned spymaster. There was no one else he trusted enough. I looked down over the balcony at the gathering nobility of the Empire, massing in the space below for the service. The imperial family were taking their places on the second level beyond us, behind the ornate carved marble doors, where they could sit and watch the proceedings in solitude and peace. Or, in Michael's case, quietly doze without anyone noticing. Afra didn't need me to command him in his task. There was nothing for me to do but to stand there looking imposing. That was a large part of our task, by the way. I tell you tales of battles and intrigue, but most of our time in service was actually spent standing in one place or another. It was quite dull, but sometimes not unpleasant. I don't remember which festival or service it was that day, and I shall not recount it to you, as they were all the same to me. It was only what happened during it that made it of any interest. I walked over to Kummis Styrbjorn, who was standing guard with a dozen men near the marble doorway, ready to respond to anything. A guardsman came over from the passage leading downstairs. "Message from the Protospatarios. We have more guests coming to the imperial balcony. Make way for them and form a guard." Styrbjorn didn't even look curious. He was not a man to argue or question. It was one of the things Harald liked about the old veteran. His foot was badly injured from the campaign in Sicily, and he would likely never go on campaign again. But as a band-on commander, he was unmatched in diligence and loyalty. The Comes quickly organized his men into an honor guard framing the doorway and had it unlocked and opened, then sent more men to line the curved balcony as far as the doorway that led down into the antechambers of the building. The sound of marching steps brought a dozen Vigla guardsmen into view along the balcony, with a small cortege of finely dressed women following them serenely, with a robed nun in their midst. I stared at them in curiosity, because they were veiled, and I could not make out who they were. They approached the marble door to the imperial balcony, and Styrbjorn opened it and stood aside to allow them through. The Vigla stopped. They were not permitted into the inner sanctum, part of the complex and interweaving layers of rules that govern the many imperial guard dogmata. The women swept through the open portal, and, just as Styrbjorn was about to shut it, I motioned to him to wait a moment, and followed through myself. Strictly, I was not supposed to be in there. It was the preserve of the first band-on, but as Harald's standard-bearer, I could do almost as I wished within the guard, and Styrbjorn just gave me a curious look and nodded, letting me pass before the ornate doors closed behind me. The little party of women approached the twin thrones confidently, and neither Zoe nor Michael looked surprised. I stood at the railing, intrigued, as one of the women, plainly dressed in the habit of a nun, stepped forwards and bowed gently to the thrones. The bow was shallow, far shallower than should have been due to the emperor and empress, but no one from the crowd of courtiers and officials admonished her. Then she turned, facing down into the open space of the great cathedral. I glanced down and saw that the entire audience was motionless, all eyes fixed upwards on the woman on the imperial balcony. Everyone in that great church was a member of the nobility of the empire, the ruling class. They knew the customs of the ceremonies and ways of power far better than I, and would have been even more surprised to see a group of anonymous women in such fine clothing paraded into the royal balcony, late for the service, with a simple nun at their head, being greeted by the Empress herself. Ah, something clicked in my mind there, you see. The woman was not late. She was exactly on time. She had arrived at a moment when it was certain she would be seen and noted by everyone, and clearly at the invitation of Zoe, who now rose to stand beside her, her magnificent smile upon her face. The room waited in rapt silence as the two women stood there, and then the nun gracefully lifted her veil to show the audience her face, and I felt my breath catch in my throat as I saw who it was. There were gasps and a wave of muttered shock from the audience as the traitor, the black sheep of the imperial family, who had been exiled to spend the rest of her life in an island monastery outside the city, was revealed. Theodora, the rebellious sister of Zoe, rumored in the city to have been behind the recent attack on the palace, an attack that was officially denied but which everyone in the city knew had happened. A battle in the palace had simply been too significant to hide. Some of the Empress's attendants brought forward an ornate chair from the back of the balcony, placing it to the side of Zoe's throne and just behind. The Empress turned and kissed her sister 3 times on each cheek, and then graciously motioned to the newly placed chair. There was a smattering of applause and appreciation from the crowd, which rapidly rose to a crescendo as the slower members of the audience realized that this was the required response to the carefully choreographed display. I was still dumbstruck, so that I did not notice one of the women who had come in with Theodora sidle over to stand at my side. "Hello, my darling Eric," a voice purred in my ear, and I turned to see the soft smile of a woman I very much hated to see, for where she stepped, trouble always followed. Maria. Chapter 3. "Isn't it lovely to see them reunited?" Maria said, looking towards the sisters with a smug smile. "What are you doing here?" I growled. My blood was seething, because the last time I had seen the woman was in the aftermath of the failed attack on the palace, where Maria was revealed to have been the one who Zoe used to covertly organize the attack by the traitor Bardas and his mercenaries. "I'm Lady Theodora's personal attendant, while she is in the city," she replied, smiling brightly. "A spy for the Empress, then?" "Oh, nothing that serious. But yes, I keep a close eye on her for Zoe. I watch her sister, others watch me. Everyone in the palace is watched now, Eric. Even you and Harald." Maria looked at me sympathetically. "But don't worry yourself about such things. The Empress's safety is your only concern." "The Emperor's and Empress's safety," I said, my cheeks tensing. She glanced back at me nonchalantly. "Yes, that's what I meant." "Then you had better not threaten it." Maria giggled softly. "Threaten? Eric, your imagination runs wild. I am a loyal servant of the Empress Zoe." I had no answer to her infuriating smugness, and simply wished to be away from her. "I have duties to attend to," I lied. "Of course you do," Maria said with a wink, and I flushed and stormed away with as little sound as possible, slipping back through the marble doors and heading to my commander. "Harald," I said, striding towards him across the great public square outside the cathedral as the service droned on. Harald looked up, and I could see from his tired look that he knew exactly what I wanted. "Do you know who was in there?" I asked. "Of course I do." "Why?" "Because the Empress ordered it, and I obeyed." "Theodora is supposed to be imprisoned." And she was, at the Empress's order. And now she isn't, at the Empress's order. I put my hands on my hips in outrage. "But why? You know her mind. I almost said, "You share her bed." But we were not alone, and Harold's eyes burned with anger at the threat of those words. It was an open secret in the guard, but still a secret. It was not spoken out loud. Harold might have killed me for saying it. Zoe certainly would. "It is not your business to know why, Eric, which is why I did not tell you." Then his expression softened, and he gestured to me to follow him, away from the other guardsmen, who were politely pretending to ignore our public argument. I followed him across the paved square to the base of the vast column of Justinian that dominated the space, with its bronze statue of the Emperor on a horse. The statue had been recently cleaned, and it shone brightly in the sun, absent its usual green stains. "What is she doing in the palace? Theodora is a traitor 3 times over." "Yes, she is," Harald agreed. "And she is dangerous. She might rebel again." "Yes," Harald said, with an infuriating nod. I was beyond perplexed and threw my arms up in frustration. "So what is she doing here?" Harald regarded me carefully, weighing what answer he should give. He stared at me harshly. Do you trust my judgment, Eric? I am starting to question it. I was hurt. I was hurt partly because my loyalty to Harald defined me, and partly because it was true. I did not trust him any more, not since he had sided with Zoe after her actions had been revealed. Of course, I snapped, lying and furious with both of us for making me lie. Harald's stare did not relent. Well, Zoe is convinced Theodora will be used to inspire a rebellion again, and the Empire cannot afford it. That is why she is here, close to the Empress. I stammered to a halt, seeing it clearly. So she is here, so she can be more closely watched? Harald nodded, and then tilted his head slightly. It's more than that. What? Harald looked around uncomfortably. Zoe is securing herself against all possible future threats. The Emperor is dying, you know that. Yes. When he dies, Zoe will have sole power, but she now believes the people will not accept that, even as popular as she is. There has never been a woman in sole power of the Empire, not since its foundation 1,000 years ago. The people and John's faction will expect her to take a new husband. I nodded. It was all as I understood it. She fears a nasty fight to take her hand in marriage. Zoe is getting old. Anyone who can force their candidate into marriage with her will likely have power over the sole emperor before too long. So the competition for her hand will be ruthless and bitter. It might even lead to civil war. Can't she choose her own husband? She could try, but who could she trust? That is what she did with Michael. She chose her own, and look how it went. He was merely a puppet for someone else. No, the problem is the same. No matter who the husband is, he could turn against her. He looked off into the distance, his face drawn. She wanted someone she could truly trust, and she only had one option. That's when it hit me. She asked you. Harald nodded. By the mother. She offered you the throne? Yes. And? I said, terrified of the answer. I refused. My mouth hung open. You refused the throne of the Empire? Harald's eyes narrowed. You are surprised? I thought you knew me better. I thought she did, too. He sighed sadly. I told her it was the wrong throne. I couldn't do it. I am also unsure how the people would take a foreign emperor, but that is another matter. She must have been angry. Furious does not begin to describe it, Harald said with a grimace. She considered having me killed. My eyes widened. How do you know? Because she discussed it while I was in the room. And what made her change her mind? Her love for you? Harald scowled. Don't be childish, Eric. It was because she still needs me. If I help her secure power, she will reward us richly. It is a great opportunity. The brutality of that calculation, that exchange, shocked me. Zoe and Harald were two of the coldest people I had ever met, as most great rulers are. But that they could discuss either marriage or execution as if they were deciding what to have for their evening meal and still be allies afterwards was simply incomprehensible to me. I was still a naive young man. I furrowed my brow. So Zoe prepares to take sole power, bringing Theodora close to control her, positioning you to secure her rule. But there is a missing factor. Surely John's faction will not accept this outcome. Michael's brother, the eunuch John, was imprisoned in the palace, but his network of alliances in the Empire was broad and powerful. Harald shrugged. Of course, the throne will always have enemies, But without a legitimate challenger of imperial blood, they will have no credibility or support from the people. I thought about that. But Michael and John still have family. What if one of them makes a claim? One of his and John's brothers or nephews? Harald nodded guardedly. It is possible, but preparations are being made to guard against that, he said with a stern look. What do you mean, preparations? I asked, feeling a tinkle of doubt. I've told you enough, Eric. You're not going to be involved in those plans. Others are more suitable. I narrowed my eyes. Thorir. You were meeting with Thorir about it this morning. Harald did not answer, did not even blink. It was all the confirmation I needed. Dear God, you're going to have them all killed. Harald looked alarmed. Be quiet, Eric. Do not speak of such things out loud. This is why I feared letting you into my confidence. Are you going to disappoint me? They are the Emperor's family, I hissed. Only when he is alive. Harald stepped in towards me, face rigid as stone. This is the way things have to be done to keep the Empire safe, Eric. More rebellions would see more of our brothers killed. I am saving them with these plans, distasteful as they may be. Can you accept it? Or perhaps you should step down, as you offered to do. I closed my eyes, pressing them tightly together, trying to master myself before I answered. Finally, I looked back at him, meeting his gaze. You think this will spare our men from more needless loss and get us what you need? Harald nodded. Swear to me that is a true aim, Harald, that you value their lives, that they have meaning to you beyond their usefulness. Swear that to me, and I will follow you in this and all other things. Harald had the decency to look a little hurt, and I believed he was hurt. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. I swear it, Eric, he said, without breaking eye contact. I breathed a deep, deep sigh of relief and looked away towards the great cathedral. Then I will trust you, Harald, and I will keep my oaths and my silence. And I could not meet his eye again, because I was ashamed that I had given in so easily, and more ashamed how little it upset me to think of those innocents who would die because of it. The Emperor has summoned me, Harald said a few days later as he adjusted his finest cloak. He had called me to his office and told me to dress for court. It was a common enough thing to do. We had to attend various state functions as guardians, and as Harald's standard-bearer, I often went with him. But this was different, and his tone made that clear. Summoned? Yes. For what? I do not know. That seems it's trouble. Whatever it is trouble. My chin sank as I considered it. Have you checked on John recently? He asked. I nodded. Are you sure he is having no outside contact? Yes. He tried to co-opt two of the jailers, but they simply told Afra. They are more afraid of Afra than of John, it seems. As they should be, Harald said with a satisfied nod. Why ask? Harald shrugged. I assume whenever there is trouble that John is behind it. So that was my first thought, that maybe somehow he had communicated with his allies. They had been causing trouble, petitioning the Emperor to see him. And what has the Emperor said? Harald looked bleak. I think his willpower is fading. I nodded. It is his brother. John uses him as a puppet. There is no brotherly love there. Michael is not so ruthless as John. Oh, I am well aware of that. Come, let's go and see what he wants. Why am I coming? I need a witness and a second opinion. I met his eye, and he gave me a pointed glance. He was doing me a favor, and showing a token of his trust, and I appreciated it. The previous month we had been as far apart as we ever had been, and the wounds were hard to heal. We went from the barracks and walked to the palace, passing the newly rebuilt gate that had been destroyed by the rebels and the walls that had been smeared with their blood during their final stand. Even the halls inside the palace, where bodies had fallen 3 deep and blood had run like water, were gleaming and unmarked. Walls had been smoothed and repainted to cover weapon scars, the damaged furnishings used to barricade hallways by desperate guardsmen replaced, like the fallen guardians themselves. All was spotless and new, as if it had never happened. But I had to walk the halls where we had fought and my brothers had died, and nothing was left there to show of their courage or sacrifice, or the dishonour of those who had killed them. I looked up, torn from my melancholy, to see Harold's sympathetic face looking back at me. I feel it too, Eric. I hear their shouts in these halls when the night is quiet. I see them lying here. Truly? Truly, I'm not made of stone. I could not think of a reply, because that is exactly what I thought of him at times, my ruthless prince, that he was carved from granite. We reached the Emperor's quarters and were quickly ushered in. Long gone were the days of having to pass John's minions. Harald could walk freely wherever he wished, and no one stood in his way. Michael was not in bed, which was unusual those days. He was sitting on the shaded private veranda in the spring morning air, a servant standing by with a fan and a medicinal drink abandoned on the elegantly wrought table at his side. He looked up and smiled weakly. "Ah, Harald. How can I serve, Basilius?" "Sit down. I want your advice, and to ask you a favor." "Come." He gestured weakly at the chair opposite him. Harald nodded courteously and took the seat offered. I stood guard in the doorway, pretending not to be there. The Emperor did not seem to mind. "What troubles you, Basilius?" "The imminency of my demise, Brutus Batharius." "Basilius, don't—" Harald tried to protest, but Michael cut him off with an irritated cough and a wave. "Don't bother. Don't be like one of those fawning sycophants who tells me this medicine or prayer will save me." He gestured to the ill-looking drink. "I am dying, and you all accepted it a long time before I did. Maybe I will cling to this world for another few years. I certainly hope so. But nothing more than that, and you know it." He gave Harald a look that dared him to argue. Harold's gaze fell, and he nodded softly. "I will not argue then, Basilius." "Call me Michael, for God's sake. No one else does. Give me that comfort. Emperor this Basilius that," Michael snapped irritably. 10 years ago I was simply a young courtier who fantasized about bedding the Empress." He gave Harald a sly look. "It's something you understand more than most." Harald stiffened, doing his best not to look nervous. Michael laughed so hard he triggered a bout of coughing. "Oh, Harald, everyone knows. Don't worry, I don't hold it against you. I pity you. You have fallen into the spider's web, as I once did, and the size of it escapes your notice. Basilius, Michael, I damn well command you to call me Michael if you won't do it out of kindness." Harald swallowed. "Michael, I intend you no disrespect or harm. I know you had no choice in the matter, because neither did I." He laughed softly. "I thought I did at the time. But now I realize I was as helpless as a fly caught in that web. I hope you escape it more easily than I did, he added bitterly. Harald sat there looking deeply uncomfortable. The only matter is that it remains a quiet secret. If the people start mocking me for it, I will have to have you killed. Michael gave Harald a sad shrug, as if it was nothing to him but a matter of small regret. I understand. I will resign and leave, if you wish. I do not wish it. There is none other I trust, oddly. For, despite our differences, and your indiscretions, I know Zoe has tried to persuade you to remove me, and I know you have refused. I know that if your friend over there pulled out his sword and came for me, you would protect me with your life. He gestured lazily at me as he spoke. What man could I trust more than that? Harald nodded. As you say. But here is the problem. Your loyalty to me, does it extend past the moment of my last breaths? Harald looked even more uncomfortable. He had clearly not been anticipating the way this conversation had gone at all. He did not reply. No? That is my concern. What happens after I die? He tapped his fingers on the side of his chair. I am writing a public decree to make my nephew, Michael, into my formal heir. Zoe will be forced by this to make a decision, to adopt him publicly as our son, or to refuse him. If she refuses him, it will be a public declaration that she intends to usurp my lineage, and it could cause a civil war. Harald listened intently, trying not to betray anything. Michael stared at him, watching for a reaction. So, what do you think? Michael asked. I think it is none of my business, Michael. I will do as you command. Rubbish! I command you to be honest. What do you think? Harald took a deep breath. He was in a very difficult situation. Zoe will take this as an attack on her. I know. And she will need someone to guide her into not responding to it as such. Harald looked pained. Ah. Yes. Now you see the purpose of my calling you here. You want me to contain her anger? Exactly. Harald sat back, hands clasped together. That will not be easy, I know. But I need my family to have very visible protection, in case Zoe makes plans to move against them when I die. He looked carefully at Harald, who showed no hint of reaction to the words, beyond looking deeply uncomfortable. I held my breath. If Michael decided we were not trustworthy, or that we might allow Zoe to kill Michael's family, we would not leave the palace grounds alive. It is not my only concern, Harald said smoothly, moving the conversation on. Michael is Admiral Stephen's son, and Stephen is disgraced. An ex-dock worker, said Michael with a nod. Well, yes. Will the people accept his son as emperor? Not on his own, no. He will rule with Zoe until Zoe dies, or her soul finally shrivels up and abandons her husk, whichever happens first. Harald looked at Michael in surprise. You would leave your nephew to rule with Zoe? You would not try to have him rule alone? Michael smiled sadly. If I could remove her, I would. But I cannot. You would not allow it. The people would not tolerate it. So, no, I must hope that he can hold his own against her. How? Basileus, I don't know your nephew well, and he seems a bright and likable lad, but not strong enough. He is not ready for this. No, he is not. And that is the second reason I have brought you here today. Michael will need a strong ally, one who can stand up to Zoe and balance the power in the palace as it has been balanced.